Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video series, I'll be taking you through all the rules you need to know to play Warhammer Underworlds. In the previous videos, we've gone through everything you need to know to play the game, up to and including the game sequence. But now it's time to move on and look at the action phase. Now we've arrived at the action phase, you're ready to do battle. Each game is made up of 3 rounds, and each round is made up of an action phase and an end phase. At the start of each action phase, the players roll off. This happens before anything else that happens at the start of an action phase. In the first round, the player who finished placing all of the fighters in their warband first adds 1 critical to their roll. The player who wins picks which player is first to take an activation in that action phase. Players take it in turns to take an activation. In their activation, a player makes an action, such as making a move or attack action with one of their fighters. After they have taken an activation, there is a power step where both players can play power cards, and we'll go into this later in the next video. And then play passes to the other player to take their activation. When both players have taken 4 activations, the action phase is over and the end phase begins. Note that although most activations allow a fighter to make an action, activations and actions are different things. Let's take a look at those different actions. You will use most of your activations to activate your fighters. When you activate a fighter, they make an action, and doing so uses one of your 4 activations for the phase. All fighters can make the following actions. They can move, attack, charge, or guard. Other actions fighters can make may be found on fighter and upgrade cards. You can also take activations to make player actions. These don't involve your fighters. Instead, these actions allow a player to do something. Doing so uses one of your 4 activations for the phase. Players can make the following actions. They can draw a power card, discard an objective card and then draw an objective card, or they can pass, which is a forfeit of an activation. It can be easy to lose track of how many activations you've taken in the heat of battle. This is why each player has 4 activation tokens, so each time you take an activation, turn one of the tokens over. With that overview of the action phase complete, let's move on and start looking at those actions in detail. And so let's start with the move action. When one of your fighters makes a move action, you move them into an adjacent hex a number of times up to their move characteristic. This is found on their fighter card that we covered in previous videos. The move can be in any direction, but you cannot move them into a hex that is blocked or occupied. A fighter that makes a move action cannot end their move action in the hex they started the move action in. When a fighter completes a move action, give that fighter a move token. A fighter with 1 or more move tokens cannot make a move or charge action. A fighter's position on the battlefield sometimes changes without them taking a move action, for example when they are pushed. When this happens, do not give that fighter a move token. When a rule tells you to push a fighter, push their miniature into an adjacent empty hex the number of times specified by the rule. Each push can be in any direction unless specified otherwise. A fighter that is pushed cannot end the push in the hex they started the push in. Before we go on to the attack action, this is a good time just to go over tokens and counters a little bit more. Some rules tell you to give a fighter a token. When you give a fighter a token, place the relevant token next to that fighter. That fighter is then said to have that token, and whenever that fighter's position on the battlefield changes, their tokens go with them. Some rules instead tell you to use a counter. They will say to give it to a fighter or place it on a power card. The most common of these are wound counters. To give that fighter a counter, place it on their fighter card. That fighter is then said to have that counter. These rules may also name these counters. The names are simply used to label the counters in the same way as keywords. The rules will explain how to use the counters or what significance they have. The reverse of a wound counter can be used to represent any kind of counter. Some rules tell you to remove a token or a counter. This means that you take that token from next to the fighter or that counter from the card it is on. If the fighter or card has none of the relevant token or counter, you cannot remove it. And here you can see we've got the move and charge token, the guard token, and then those generic counters. Now we've taken care of tokens and counters, let's move on to the attack action. Most fighters have at least one attack action on their fighter card. Fighters can gain additional attack actions when they are given an attack action upgrade, or in some cases, when they are inspired. Fighters can even gain temporary attack actions from some gambits. A fighter must have a target that is within range and visible to be able to make an attack action. And all attack actions have the following information. Number 1, they'll have a name. Some attack actions have the spell symbol by their name. This means they are spell attack actions. Number 2 is the range characteristic. A fighter making an attack action can target a visible fighter within a number of hexes equal to the attack action's range characteristic. So a range 1 attack action can only target enemy fighters within 1 hex of the fighter making the attack action. The distance to the target does not affect the range characteristic. For example, a range 3 attack action which targets an adjacent fighter is still a range 3 attack action. Some cards may refer to, for example, range 3 plus attack actions. This means all attack actions with a range characteristic of the stated value and higher. Number 3 is the dice characteristic. This characteristic is a number and a symbol. The number tells you how many attack dice to roll when making the attack action. The more dice you roll for an attack action, the greater your chance of success. The symbol tells you which symbol you need to roll on the attack dice for a success. Spell attack actions use magic dice instead and have different symbols you need to roll for a success. Spell attack actions may have a hyphen instead of a number. Where this is the case, roll a number of magic dice equal to the fighter's wizard level. Number 4 is the damage characteristic. This tells you how much damage the attacking fighter deals to the target if the attack action is successful. And then finally, number 5, some attack actions have additional rules text, which may refer to a number of common abilities such as cleave and knockback, or they may include other rules that change how the attack action works. Now we'll look at line of sight and then we'll go on and do an example of the combat sequence. Line of sight is used to determine which fighters are visible to each fighter. It is usually used when checking if one fighter can make an attack action that targets another. Fighters have line of sight in all directions. It doesn't matter which way the miniature is facing. To check if a fighter has line of sight to a hex, draw a straight imaginary line from the centre of the hex they are in to the centre of the hex in question. If that line goes through or touches any blocked hex or goes off the edge of the battlefield, the fighter does not have line of sight to that hex. Otherwise, they have line of sight to that hex and anything in that hex is visible to that fighter. Fighters and occupied hexes do not block line of sight. Here you can see that Mayari has line of sight to all hexes labelled A, but does not have line of sight to any of the hexes labelled B. The imaginary line that would run from Mayari's hex to this hex here, marked B, would run through the line of the blocked hex and therefore Miari does not have line of sight to that hex. Now let's look at the combat sequence. When you choose one of your fighters to make an attack action, follow this sequence. This is called the combat sequence, and once the sequence is complete, that action has been resolved. A fighter making an attack action is referred to as an attacker, while that action is being resolved, and that fighter's player is referred to as the attacking player. Step 1 of the combat sequence is to declare attack action. Pick an attack action and a target. You can only pick one attack action, which will be on the attacker's fighter card or on an upgrade that fighter has. And the target must be within the attack action's range and visible to the attacker. You cannot target a friendly fighter. Step 2. The attack roll. Roll a number of attack dice equal to the attack action's dice characteristic, or magic dice if the attack action is a spell. Step 3 is the defense roll. The target's player rolls a number of defense dice equal to the target's defense characteristic. The target's defense characteristic also shows which symbol is a success. In step 4, we determine success. Compare how many success symbols you both rolled. If you rolled more than your opponent, this is called a critical hit. The attack action succeeds, and then you move on to step 5. But if your opponent rolled more than you, this is called a miss. The attack action fails, and then you should skip to step 8. If you rolled the same number of success symbols, including if neither of you rolled any, compare how many successes you both rolled. If you rolled more than your opponent and you rolled at least one success symbol, this is called a critical hit. The attack action succeeds and go to step 5. If you rolled more than your opponent but you did not roll any success symbols, this is called a hit. The attack action succeeds and you go to step 5. If you rolled the same number as your opponent and you rolled at least one success, this is called a draw. The attack action fails and so you skip to step 7. Otherwise, this is called a miss and the attack action fails, so skip to step 8. If a spell action succeeds, it is cast, and we'll cover this in a later video. In step 5, we deal damage. The attacker deals damage to the target equal to the damage characteristic of the attack action. In step 6, we check if the target is taken out of action. If the target has a number of wound counters that is equal to or greater than their wounds characteristic, they are taken out of action, and if this happens, you skip to step 8. In step 7, we drive back. The target can be driven back, and in some cases, the target may even be trapped. And the final step is step 8, the end sequence. This is where the attack action ends. Note that fighters do not gain a token for making an attack action. A single fighter can make multiple attack actions in the same round. We also have to look at whether they're outmaneuvered. So if at the start of any of the steps from 2 to 5, the target is no longer visible and or within range, the attack action fails, and so we would skip straight to step 8. In the combat sequence, we talked about the drive back step. So let's have a look about what it means to be driven back. If the target of an attack action can be driven back, the attacking player can choose to push the target 1 hex. This could be in any direction that takes the target further away from the attacker. If the attacking player chooses not to, the fighter is not driven back. We also mentioned that they could be trapped, and if the target of a failed attack action could be driven back, but there is no hex they could be pushed into, for example because those hexes are occupied or because they are in an edge hex, the target is trapped. When a target is trapped, the attack action succeeds instead of failing. It is a hit, and if it is a spell, it is cast. Return to step 5 of the combat sequence where we deal damage. Do not resolve step 7, the drive back step, a second time for this attack action. Instead, after step 6, check if the target is taken out of action and then skip to step 8 which is the end sequence. Now let's look at support. In combat, fighters rarely have the luxury of facing their foe one-on-one. Each fighter's allies would try to help them and hinder their enemies, and in Warhammer Underworlds, this is represented by support. There's a few things to note. The first is that the attacker receives support for each other friendly fighter that is adjacent to their target. Also, the target receives support for each other friendly fighter that is adjacent to the attacker. A fighter who provides support in this way is said to be supporting. If a fighter has one supporting fighter, rolls with this symbol are successes in their attack or defense roll. If a fighter has two or more supporting fighters, rolls with this symbol or this symbol are successes in their attack or defense roll. Note that although supporting fighters are counted as described for spell attack actions, the magic dice do not have these symbols. This means that while rolls with those symbols can be successes in the defense roll for the target of a spell attack action, they cannot be rolled in the attack roll for an attacker making a spell attack action. Now let's look at damage. When a fighter is dealt damage, take a number of wound counters equal to the amount of damage dealt, which will usually be the damage characteristics of an attack action that targeted them and succeeded, and give them to that fighter by placing them on that fighter's fighter card. Sometimes you need to know who or what is considered to have dealt damage to a fighter. If an attack action or an upgrade a fighter has deals damage, the fighter is said to have dealt that damage and, if relevant, to have taken that fighter out of action. If a gambit spell or backlash deals damage, the wizard that was casting the spell is said to have dealt that damage and, if relevant, to have taken that fighter out of action. If another card deals damage, the warband of the player who used that card is said to have dealt that damage and, if relevant, to have taken that fighter out of action. If a lethal hex deals damage, the lethal hex is said to have dealt that damage and, if relevant, to have taken that fighter out of action. This is true even when a fighter is pushed into a lethal hex during an attack action. Now let's look at what it means to be out of action. If a fighter has a number of wound counters equal to or greater than their wounds characteristic, that fighter is taken out of action. When a fighter is taken out of action, take them off the battlefield and clear all of their tokens from the battlefield. In addition, clear all counters from their fighter card and from their upgrades. Note that these tokens and counters are not said to have been removed, so for example, the fighter is not healed. Do not discard the fighter's upgrades. A fighter that is out of action plays no further part in the game. They cannot be activated, they cannot become inspired, they cannot make actions, and you cannot use any abilities on their upgrades, and so on. When an enemy fighter is taken out of action, gain 1 glory point. If that enemy fighter had a wounds characteristic of 6 or more, gain 1 additional glory point. Now let's look at healing. Some cards allow you to remove wound counters from a fighter. This is known as healing. If a card tells you to heal X, where X is a number, that means that you remove that number of wound counters from the fighter or fighters described by the card. If they do not have enough wound counters, simply remove all their wound counters. A fighter is only said to have been healed if at least 1 wound counter was removed from that fighter card. The final thing to look at for attack action are the attack action keywords, and let's start with cleave. If an attack action has the cleave keyword, rolls with this symbol cannot be successes in the defense roll. Next, we've got ensnare. If an attack action has the ensnare keyword, rolls with this symbol cannot be successes in the defense roll. The next keyword is knockback. If an attack action has the Knockback X keyword, where X is a number, when the attack action is successful, the attacking player can drive the target back a number of additional hexes up to the value of X. This means that if an attack action with a Knockback 2 succeeds, the attacking player can drive the target back 1 hex for the successful attack action, following the normal combat sequence, and then up to 2 further hexes for the knockback. The push must continue in the same direction. If the attacking player cannot push the target further in that direction, the target is not pushed any further. If an attack action has 2 or more rules giving it knockback, add the numbers together for a combined total. For example, if an attack action has 2 rules giving it knockback 1, it actually has knockback 2. Note that the trap rule, which we covered earlier, does not apply to knockback, as knockback only applies to attack actions that succeeded. The final attack action keyword is scything. If an attack action has the scything keyword, when that attack action is made, it targets each enemy fighter adjacent to the attacker. If there is only one adjacent enemy fighter, the attack action is resolved as if it didn't have this ability. Otherwise, the attack action is resolved as a super action, which we'll cover in the next video. The attacking player resolves the attack action against each of the targets separately in whatever order they choose. Because each attack action is resolved separately, if there is a rule in effect that affects the next attack action, it will only affect the first attack action resolved in this way, not the whole super action. That brings us to the end of the move and attack parts of the action phase, so come and join me in the next video where we'll look at charge, guard and the power step. I hope you enjoyed the video and I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback, so please join in the comment section below. It'll be great to hear from you. If you like this content and would like to support the channel, then please check out my Patreon page. And thanks to everyone who's joined so far. It's really awesome. We hang out on Discord, talk about the hobby, share ideas and help each other out, and you'll get some perks there that you're not going to find anywhere else. So I'll put a link in the description and it'll be great to see you there. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you'll come and join me for the next video in this series. Please like if you like it, subscribe for more videos like this, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.